So today is May the 1st, International Workers' Day, and every year on this day, politicians give speeches about the dignity of labor and the achievements of working people. Trade unions hold marches, governments issue statements, and then on May the 2nd, everything goes back to exactly the way it was before. The real wages stagnate, the working hours remain long, the job security continues to erode. The gap between what workers produce and what workers are paid continues to widen. And the fundamental economic arrangement that this day was created to challenge remains exactly as it was. I think that arrangement deserves an honest accounting today. Not a celebration, not a commemoration, an honest economic analysis of what has actually happened to workers over the past 50 years, measured in the numbers that matter. Because the numbers tell a story that is very different from the speeches. Let me start where this day starts, in 1886. Because to understand the gap between what this day promises and what it delivers, you need to understand what it was originally about and how completely the conditions that created it have returned. In the spring of 1886, workers across the United States were engaged in a mass movement for the 8-hour working day. The standard working day at the time was 10 to 12 hours or more, 6 days a week, in conditions that were dangerous, physically brutal, and entirely subject to the employer's discretion. The movement was explicit in its demand and its logic. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours for what we will. On May the 1st, 1886, approximately 340,000 workers across the United States went on strike in support of the 8-hour day. In Chicago, the center of the movement, the strikes led to confrontations with police that culminated in the Haymarket Square events of May 4th, in which a bomb was thrown during a workers' meeting and 8 labor organizers were subsequently arrested, tried, and executed or imprisoned in a process that most serious legal historians have characterized as a miscarriage of justice. The labor movement paid a high price for the 8-hour day. And eventually, over the following decades, it won. The 8-hour standard became embedded in law. Over time, pay requirements were established, child labor was restricted, workplace safety regulations were created, collective bargaining rights were recognized. The movement that began in the spring of 1886 changed the material conditions of working people in the industrialized world in ways that were real and consequential, and that most people alive today take entirely for granted. And if you are finding this analysis useful, please subscribe. I cover these structural economic realities every week because the relationship between labor and capital, between workers and the systems that employ them, is the foundation on which every household budget, every standard of living, and every economic trajectory is built. Now let me give you the numbers that tell you what has happened since those gains were won, because the most important economic story of the past 50 years is not the story that is being told on days like today. It is the story of how the gains that workers fought for and won in the 20th century have been systematically and quietly reversed through economic mechanisms that are more difficult to march against than a factory owner with a 12-hour day. The first and most important number is the divergence between productivity and compensation. From approximately 1948 to 1973, productivity and worker compensation grew at roughly the same rate in the United States. When workers produced more, they were paid more. The gains of economic growth were shared between capital and labor in a reasonably proportional way. This was the era of the post-war social contract in which strong unions, tight labor markets, and policies that favored broad-based growth produced the most sustained expansion of middle-class living standards in American history. That relationship broke around 1973 to 1975. The specific causes are multiple and contested. The oil shocks of the 1970s disrupted the post-war economic settlement. The shift toward financial deregulation and shareholder primacy changed how corporations allocated their returns. Globalization put domestic workers in direct wage competition with workers in low-income countries for the first time. And the systematic weakening of union bargaining power removed the institutional mechanism through which workers had historically claimed their share of productivity gains. Whatever the causes, the consequences are precisely documented. Since 1973, American worker productivity has grown by approximately 60 to 70%, while median worker compensation, adjusted for inflation, grew by approximately 10 to 15% over the same period. Productivity up 65%, compensation up 12%. That gap, approximately 50 percentage points over 5 decades, is not an abstraction. It is the measure of economic value that workers created and did not receive. It is the measure of what was transferred from labor to capital during the era of financialization and globalization. If median worker compensation had kept pace with productivity growth since 1973 the way it did during the post-war period, the median American worker would be earning approximately twice what they currently earn. That is the cost of the broken relationship between productivity and pay, not in abstract percentage points, in actual dollars, not in workers' pockets today. The second number is the decline of union membership. In 1954, approximately 35% of American workers belonged to a union. Union membership peaked and then began its long decline. By 2024, union membership had fallen to approximately 10% of the American workforce. This matters economically because unions are the primary mechanism through which workers exercise collective bargaining power, the ability to negotiate wages, benefits, and working conditions from a position of collective strength rather than individual weakness. The decline of union membership is directly correlated with the divergence between productivity and compensation I just described. When workers have collective bargaining power, they capture a larger share of the value they create. When they bargain individually, they capture less. The math of labor market power is not complicated. An individual worker negotiating with a corporation that employs thousands has almost no bargaining power. The same worker negotiating as part of a collective has significantly more. The systematic decline of union membership since the 1970s is one of the primary mechanisms through which the gains of the labor movement were reversed without most people noticing. It happened gradually, sector by sector, workplace by workplace, over decades. Manufacturing unions weakened as factories moved offshore. Private sector service industry unions were aggressively resisted by employers who had learned from the crushing of the air traffic controller strike in 1981 that government would not stand in the way of aggressive union busting. Right-to-work legislation spread across states, allowing workers to benefit from union contracts without paying union dues, which steadily drained the financial resources that unions needed to organize and bargain. The result is the wage stagnation I described. Weaker unions means less bargaining power. Less bargaining power means less compensation per unit of productivity. And that is precisely where the missing dollars from the last 50 years went. If you have not subscribed yet, please do that now. The economic mechanisms I am describing determine whether the work you do translates into economic security or into a permanent scramble to keep up with costs that rise faster than your wages. The third number is the rise of precarious work. The gig economy, the contractor model, the 0 hours contract, the on-demand workforce. These arrangements have proliferated across the economy over the past 2 decades in ways that are systematically favorable to employers and systematically unfavorable to workers. A full-time employee has legal protections. They receive employer contributions to social insurance. They accumulate seniority and benefits over time. They have some protection against arbitrary dismissal. A gig worker or independent contractor has none of these protections. They bear all the risk of income variability. They pay both sides of social insurance contributions. They receive no benefits. They accumulate no seniority. They can be deactivated from the platform that employs them with no notice and no recourse. The reclassification of what are economically employment relationships as independent contracting relationships is one of the most consequential labor market developments of the past generation. It is important to understand what makes this reclassification so significant economically. The legal distinction between an employee and an independent contractor determines who bears the risk of income variability, who contributes to social insurance, who receives benefits, who has legal protections against dismissal, and who accumulates the seniority and institutional standing that translates over a career into financial security. By reclassifying employment as contracting, companies have shifted all of those costs and all of that risk onto the workers, while retaining all of the benefits of having a workforce available on demand. The gig worker waiting for a ride request to appear on their phone is bearing all of the economic risk that the employer once bore and receiving none of the economic protections that a century of labor movement victories had established. This is not incidental. It is the business model. The fourth dimension is what is coming, because the story of what happened to workers over the past 50 years is, in some respects, preparation for understanding what is coming over the next 20. Artificial intelligence and automation are not unique threats to workers. Every major technological revolution has displaced categories of work and created new categories. The Industrial Revolution did it. The mechanization of agriculture did it. The computerization of office work did it. Each transition produced significant short-term dislocation for the workers whose specific skills became less valuable, and each ultimately produced new categories of work that employed the next generation. The standard reassurance about AI follows this pattern. Do not worry. New jobs will be created. They always are. And that reassurance may ultimately prove correct. But the speed, the breadth, and the particular nature of AI-driven displacement has characteristics that distinguish it meaningfully from previous technological transitions. Previous automation displaced manual, repetitive, physical labor while simultaneously creating demand for cognitive, analytical, and relational work. The displaced factory worker was told to retrain as a knowledge worker. AI is beginning to automate cognitive, analytical, and increasingly relational work. The radiologist whose diagnostic skills took a decade to develop. The paralegal whose document review work took years to master. The customer service representative whose conversational and problem-solving abilities seemed uniquely human. All of these roles are already being automated at meaningful scale. The displacement is moving up the skill ladder, not creating a new ladder above it. And the workers told throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s that education and skills were the durable protection against automation are discovering that the automation has followed them into the knowledge economy. The honest economic question for workers today is not whether automation will affect their sector. It will. The question is what institutional framework exists to ensure that the productivity gains from automation, which will be real and very large, are distributed in ways that do not simply repeat the productivity compensation divergence of the past 50 years at a dramatically faster pace and far larger scale. That is what this day was always about. Not nostalgia, not ceremony. The concrete economic question of how the gains from human productive capacity, whether that capacity comes from a worker's hands or from an algorithm that was trained on human knowledge, are distributed between those who own the capital and those who provide the labor. In 1886, workers in the streets of Chicago were asking that question. In 2025, the answer to that question is no more settled than it was then, and the economic stakes are no smaller. Subscribe for more analysis of these structural economic realities explained clearly and plainly. And tell me in the comments, do you think workers today have more or less power than 50 years ago? I will see you next time.